Welcome to the Talking Toughness series of podcasts, where we examine the mental toughness concept with guests from a wide range of sectors, illustrating that our mental approach to what happens to us and around us matters for all of us. Our guests come from the worlds of business and public service, education, social mobility, sport, and health. They all share their experiences and their observations about the factors that have enabled them to survive and to thrive on their journey through life. Many guests have gone further and incorporated the concept into what they do as coaches, trainers, managers, and leaders, helping others to thrive in their turn. Their experiences are valuable to those of us who strive to do the same. Our guest for this very special podcast is Dean Mumm. Now, John and I have already created a podcast with Dean, which explored his time as captain of the Wallabies, the Australian National Rugby Union team, and his captaincy of Exeter Chiefs Rugby Club. And there's a lot of learning in there. In our podcasts, we tend to explore people's responses to challenges in the workplace, in sport, in education, and so on, to extract the learning from those experiences, to which we can often relate quite easily. This podcast is different. We were both astonished and surprised to learn that Dean and his wife Sarah had lost their first 4 children to preterm birth. It's difficult to imagine what that must feel like. So we are very pleased that Dean agreed to share something of his and Sarah's experiences with us. In this podcast, Dean shares with us with some amazing clarity what happened, how they felt, and importantly and ultimately how they responded. It's a description of self-belief, of hope, of optimism, of grit and determination. Everything you could associate with mental toughness. Now they're parents to 2 beautiful children. Dean and Sarah now channel their considerable energy into the Bourne Foundation, raising funds to support research into preterm birth. If anybody wants to understand what a positive and resilient mindset is and what it can achieve, this podcast captures it to a T. It's humbling and inspiring in equal measure. We welcome back Dean and his story. Welcome, Dean. Welcome back to our Talking Toughness podcast.
Thank you. Yeah, delighted to be back with you both. Thanks for having us, Doug and John.
Yeah, so for the listener, we've already had a podcast with Dean, and that focused on one of his big interests and his passions. That's being an elite rugby player, captain of the Wallabies, captain of Exeter Chiefs, and we explored that. But in Dean's world, there is another area where he is passionate, and it has led to Dean and his wife setting up a charity which is called Bourne HMRI, and that's what we would like to explore today. So can we start, Dean, with you talking about the backstory, what took you to this and why it's become such a passion?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I suppose it all comes from the fact, briefly, if people ask us how many kids we've got, we say 2 because we've got 2 boys, and it's night time here in Australia, and they're hopefully sleeping upstairs. But really, we've got 6 children, 4 of whom were born too early, and 4 of whom didn't survive. So it's a little bit burdensome to say to someone when they ask how many kids, you say 6, but 4 aren't here. But that's the reality for us. And there were in 3 different incidences. So Sophie was born at 21 weeks, and my son Henry was born at 28 weeks, but he died 9 days later. He got an infection, which when you're a little fella like he was, it's too hard to do it. And then we had twins, Ella and Grace, who were born at 20 weeks, and they were identical twins, and unfortunately they had a thing called twin-to-twin syndrome. Now, all of the reasons why our children passed away was the 3 separate incidences, but really if all of those were later in a term or later on in the pregnancy, then they would have survived. So it just it was shitty luck, to be fair. But it was a incredibly traumatic period for us in our life. But also has kind of led us to start a charity now, Bourne HMRI, which does research into the prevention of preterm birth. And we choose research because we think, the greatest advances that can happen from thinking about why something happens. And we also, preterm birth means a lot for us, not but what we've been through, but when we sort of realized we weren't alone and far from it. There's 15 million babies born preterm a year, 1 million of those die. In Australia here, there's 26,000 families per annum that have to deal and interact with preterm birth. You're certainly not alone, and it is something that in terms of health economics has got a huge cost to the economy as well, because the cost of a child in NICU, but also more importantly, it is the leading cause of death and disability in children under 5. And so the cost of rehabbing and caring for a child with a severe disability until 18 is very, very high. And so we look back and go, what can we do about it? What can we do? Well, let's look at the root cause and see if we can give every baby the best chance to the start of life.
And that research then, Dean, is the focus there on how you prevent preterm birth, or how to care for those that are born preterm, or a bit of both?
Yeah, I mean, actually, advancements in the care of children is really amazing. For neonatal intensive cares, anyone that's ever been in one, they are incredible people and they're incredible places. But I suppose for us, we want to go back before that and understand why it happens in the first place. And there's so much we don't know about labour. We don't think that it should be normalised in any way for anyone to ever go to intensive care. Like, if you or I are in intensive care, we're pretty unwell. I don't want it to be a win for a kid to be in intensive care. I want to understand why it's happening, and I want to understand how we can prevent that. So why does labour happen in the first place? What is they don't know the reason for the onset of labour for full-term people, let alone preterm. And it turns out there's slight differences between the two. And if you are identified, how do we identify you as being high risk? And then if you are high risk, how do we apply treatment proactively rather than reactively? Because reactive ones are really ineffective. So you got to think, if you've got a pregnant woman, you can't give them drugs because that affects the child, certain drugs. For instance, we know that the medication you use on asthma is really effective because the lining of your larynx is very similar to the lining of your uterus, but you can't give that medication to pregnant women because it affects the child. So there are a lot of sort of nuances that happen in there. So we're looking at how to stop it, in the first place. How do we just keep babies in the womb?
Yeah, and the figures are astonishing, really. And we were talking before. It's only for me, it's only sort of when you have a personal experience of it, of someone, or happens to you, that you kind of get any sense. Otherwise, you kind of go around ignorant, recognizing that. There's something you mentioned before that I was really surprised. You said that the rate was increasing. Is that right?
Yeah, that is. You can't really. Let's just focus on the rate rather than the reason behind it. But there's probably a greater dispersion of people's age when they're having children, or we're getting better at keeping children in for longer. So, but it is in pretty much all developed countries in the world that this rate of preterm birth is increasing, and there is also in terms of a demographic, the people over the lower socioeconomic have a higher rate of preterm birth than those who are wealthier. So it's kind of a really interesting thing of how do we do it. But when you think about, here's a stat which I think will be so in the last 50 years there's been no new treatments for stopping labour in preterm people, none. Like zero. like think about the developments in cancer, in teen cancer, in leukemia, in diabetes, in name it, cystic fibrosis, whatever. There's been not like those treatments have come leaps and bounds. The rate of leukemia and death in children used to be 20%. Rate of survival was 20%. Now over 85. Through research, through money. So it's like as a root cause, this for us is why we're really passionate about it, because we think it can make a really big difference to a lot of people's lives.
Absolutely, Dean. Just listening to you, I'm kind of in awe of what you're doing. But what I think a lot of people will also be interested in is, we're talking about the impact on the child and perhaps the mother, but what about the impact on you and your wife? Because we talk about mental toughness a lot and about dealing with setbacks and remaining optimistic, in the midst of adversity. How on earth do you do that in these situations?
Yeah, it's not easy. It wasn't easy. The thing was, in the first, as I mentioned before, that so many people who have their first child are basically the incidence of preterm birth is very high in people with their first child, because they just don't know, and that's cool. You don't know what you don't know. And for us, that was, unfortunately, we lost Sophie, and there was a lot of shock from that, in the fact that we didn't actually, when that happened, we didn't actually name her Sophie until about 3 or 4 months after. We couldn't get our head around it, and so she was baby mum, and we sort of buried her, but you just had so much shock. And we were overseas, we were in Exeter, and incredible people taking care of us, but when you go home, then you're at home and there's just the two of you, and that's really hard, and we're away from support structures, etc. But one of the anxiety that comes in the following pregnancies is overwhelming.
Wow.
In terms of the little pains that are normal, that you think they're okay, you think will go away, just heighten your anxiety. And it's really interesting that we often give deference to sports stars and celebrities and CEOs, but man, the people the nurses, the midwives, the doctors, the obstetricians, to be fair, probably the person next to you probably deserves more deference sometimes, but they're like those people that can assuage someone's fears and anxieties when they're having a child, about to have a child, and they deserve all the credit. Like it's amazing, but you go through this process, and anything, if you have failure, you try and assess the failure, understand why, and then you try and put sort of basically risk management in place. And we tried to do that on successive times. But I think the way we kept going, and my wife is incredibly tough, but no one ever said no, No one said you can't do it. There's no reason why you can't have children. So in the absence of no, it kind of has to be a yes, doesn't it? Like if you want to continue. So that was for us was, well, no one's saying we can't have children. Yes, it's going to be difficult, but yes, we want a family. So what do? You keep going. And I suppose that's why we've got 2 boys upstairs, I suppose. And it was bloody hard, but you got to walk that track.
Yeah, and I suppose no one's saying no, so it's great from that sort of medical point of view. There's no kind of reason why, but geez, I can't help but feel the easy option is to think maybe we say no. I keep putting myself through that?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, if you weigh it up I work in risk. You weigh it up from a risk point of view, you probably don't take that one on. But there's no other choice. There's no. I mean, there are alternate ways, and I'm not diminishing any alternate way at all. But it's for us. We wanted to have the opportunity to have a family, and this was the way. No one was saying no. And I mean, to be fair, if you knew the physical pain and things that Sarah went through, that's more than enough to know, let alone the mental anguish and the anxiety that I spoke about before. But yeah, she's bloody amazing.
Yeah. And how then, because obviously that kind of scenario is incredibly difficult for any couple. But you did it while you were away, so you want their family. How much does that kind of support network make a difference when you're dealing with those situations, and how do you kind of find an alternative when you don't have your normal support network?
Yeah, I think there's a few things in that. Trauma's hard, but no one misses out on trauma. You and I, whatever, we all got it. This was our dose when we got it, but no one skips it. It comes in different forms. You don't know when it's coming, but it will at some stage. And really interestingly, I thought Sophie was horrible, which it was, but then Henry was probably worse in terms of the acute trauma. And then I thought, well, we probably had our fill. And then Ella and Grace come in really what was a really horrific day. And we almost lost Sarah as well. She lost 3.5 litres of blood. We've only got about 5. So, man, like that was a bad day. And so you think you've had your worst possible day, and then another one worse comes along at some stage, but you don't know when that is. And you can, and ultimately for us, like you front up and you keep going. Like I know I don't want to be a martyr about it, but it's sort of, that was kind of the mentality, like you just keep going, because at this stage we'd had Alfie, and Alfie was amazing. And one of the things I think it's really taught us is we don't take many days for granted with our children. So if you look at one of the gifts that this has given us, is one, we've been able to start a charity and try and leverage and make some difference. But two, on a daily basis, we don't take for granted that we've got children. And every night we go in and, sneak in and, maybe that, it's probably going to piss them off at some stage, but we sneak in and just check they're okay and say goodnight and go to bed. And we're like, what? And all kids can be frustrating and get your nerves, but ultimately every night you go, God, I'm grateful to have them. And that's a really lovely gift, I think. And so in terms of some of the things we've got from it, it's been amazing. Like I've also, for the charity, I've been to the North Pole, I've crossed Costa Rica. Like all of these things wouldn't have happened if there wasn't the fork in the road some 10 years ago. And when last October, when we finished Costa Rica, it just happened to be with no reason or rationale or intent that it was exactly 10 years since we lost Sophie. Wow. And you sort of sit there and encapsulate and think, well, what a journey, like it was, to be fair, it was really shit. But also there's been some shoots of green from some pretty turned over dirt, basically.
I think the thing that strikes me, Dean, is I've got goosebumps listening to you. It's about this sense of hope and optimism that's coming through. A few years ago, I had a colleague who experienced exactly what you experienced. He and his wife lost a child, but then they had a child born at 24 weeks, and that child survived. But I'm not sure my colleague has survived as well as you have. So have you ever thought about where does this note of hope and optimism and sort of belief that, there is something there, where that's come from?
No, I never really, but it kind of, in the absence of no is a yes, in the absence of optimism is negativity. I can sit with trauma okay in the moment, but I want to move from it as well. And I believe in I believe that people and situations can change, and that they will change if you sort of look at it in the right way. And yeah, I don't know what it is. Maybe it's a sporting thing where you take a loss and you move on to the next week and still think you can win next week. And maybe there's something like that in there. I don't know, but I think also I think a lot of people don't think they're resilient, and they certainly don't give themselves credit for being resilient. But like, let's get really basic around it. If you're here, if you're breathing, you are resilient and you're winning. Like, if you're breathing and you're living, you're not dead and you're still in with a chance. Like, that's, I don't know, like, that's kind of how I see it. And I think it's like your friend is incredibly resilient. And they may not give themselves credit for being that, but they're here. Every one of us went through something we'd never experienced before in a pandemic. And clearly it was bad. It was horrific. We lost lots of people, but the rest of us are here. We're still here, and we still went through something. Like, give yourself credit. We're a pretty resilient bunch.
Yeah. But I think from my perspective, you're describing something a little bit more than resilience. Resilience is being able to cope with what's happened, but you've got this kind of optimistic undertone to what you're describing, that it's happened, tomorrow can be better. Tomorrow we can still do what we tried to do yesterday. That's what's coming through for me.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And I genuinely believe that. I mean, unless we're down by 50 points with 10 to go, we probably can't win it. But I mean, there's always a way, isn't there? There's someone that's always got through. For so many times, if we run the stats on what happened, like if you run the stats for, unfortunately, what happened with Ella and Grace, then the identical twins are like 1 in 10,000 chance, and then the chance of getting twin-to-twin syndrome is like 1 in 15,000 or whatever. Like, I mean, we're talking a lot of zeros here if we're running that, and it happened, and it was shit. But like, I think back, all right. So if I sort of normalize it in a way. And this is a crude analogy, so if you think you've had it, we've all been in the gym and we've all had a trainer or someone go at us, and you've had a really, really hard session, and you feel like halfway through that session, the lactic's building up, you've got to go to the bin, maybe you've got to vomit, you don't think you can get through, but the reality is you get through, and then that is your hardest session until someone else gives you an even harder session. And then you think that you can't make it, and you think you can't get it through, but you get through. Like, I don't know. I'm sort of going back to that resilience, which I know you don't want to go there, but it's kind of what it is. I think you will survive. You will get through. And the odds are that you'll be here.
Oh, Dean, we completely with you on resilience. I think resilience is a very valuable quality. I just suspect you're adding something to it. You're demonstrating something in addition to that.
I just wondered there, Dean. So I definitely wouldn't be an expert now in kind of trauma-related growth and that kind of sort of growth from necessary suffering and things like that people talk about. But having just the way you kind of tell the story and kind of where you're at all these years later, yourself and Sarah must feel kind of bulletproof by now, do you?
Probably not, mate. No, it's not bulletproof, but I know we can run pretty deep. I know we can take a lot, and trauma can push people apart or it can pull you together, and we've had both. And I'm not trying to say that we're geniuses in it, and it's pulled us apart and it's pulled us together. We know we can handle a bit, and still be here. And it's kind of, like you get to the mental toughness framework, there is a confidence that you can get through something, that comes from it. And, you know, I know after we had Ella and Grace, we sat there, and there's two things. One, in every one of the pregnancies that failed, you know, which is a hard term, but it's in reality, that's what it is. There is, and they were so dark, but there's the most lovely moments of my life have been almost immediately associated with those as well, because that's 4 children that I wouldn't have otherwise got to meet. And I don't, like you think that it takes a long, long time to have connection with someone. It takes a long time, but connection can be like that.
Yeah.
When you meet your child, you know, and then that's 3 moments that I've got instantaneous connection, that Sarah and I are in that room, no one else is in there. And that's my memory. And that is like, out of the dark comes this immense light, you know, like it's gold, you know. And so I don't want to give that up. And then also, you know, like, you know, and fortunately, like the second and third were somewhat easier to get through because we knew we'd been through the first. And you knew you'd been, like, again, the crude analogy, you knew you'd been through that first session, you know, like we'd found a way through, and it wasn't easy, but we had this, and I like it. And I sort of briefly mentioned the third one. It was bad. It was really traumatic. It was a bad morning, you know, but it was either later that day or the next day, a counsellor came in and started talking and asking us questions and talking us through it. And we sort of told our story a little bit, and like, unfortunately we're here for the third time. And then her sort of recommendation was, well, I'm not going to recommend you need to see someone because I think you'll be okay. And, you know, it's kind of like, I think we probably will be as well, but it's going to take time, and it always sits with you. But yeah, we'll probably get through. Yeah.
We really appreciate you opening up like this, Dean. It's been astonishing having this conversation with you. I followed your adventures in Costa Rica. How much did you raise on that?
We raised about 80,000 Aussie, wow, which was great. So we have a goal, and we're not crazy ambitious because we've both got full-time jobs and young kids as well. So yeah, we want to raise 150k Australian a year, because that'll allow us to fund a postdoctoral research fellow every year if we can do that. So at the moment we've got an incredible young lady who's a bioinformatician who's sort of a specialist data. She works through the immense amount of data that comes through these research projects and tries to pull trends and things from them. So that's who we're funding, and that 80k helped us reappoint her as the fellow for another 18 months. And so
what's the next fundraising activity?
It's just a dinner this time around, mate.
Oh, that's okay. That's fine.
That sounds far better than the North Pole. And
yeah, I mean, the North Pole was -30, and Costa Rica was +35. So that 65-degree change was I probably can give that a break for a moment. There'll be something else, but it may not be as harebrained as the previous ones.
Okay, so if people are listening and they feel moved to support the charity, how can they get in touch with you or the charity?
Yeah, I mean, best way to do it is, like I assume this will probably go on LinkedIn. Is check me out on LinkedIn at Dean Mumm. That's one way to do it. The other way is hmri.org.au/Bourne, and that you'll find the ability there to fundraise. But there's also Instagram, etc. on there. So that's a way. We'd love your support. Love you to be part of the team.
Well, I hope a lot of people do support it. I mean, the one thing, it's interesting. I've been listening to you. You've been spellbound, to be honest, Dean. But one of the things you said right at the beginning really resonated with me. And that was you used this phrase, we weren't alone. And the idea, and I think it's quite important in the context of all of this, because you do come across people who suffer experiences that are awful, but they think it's only happening to them. actually that's not true, is it?
No. Like everyone has trauma or anguish or whatever it is. No one misses out. And the reality is, it's a sad reality, but there's hope in there as well, is that the likelihood is someone else has been through what you've been through, and the likelihood is that they're probably okay. And I can't give you a time frame when that will happen. It's not going to happen straight away, but in the long run, most people are okay, and that's kind of optimistic. Yeah.
I think it's such an important kind of premise to have there. It really struck me when you first mentioned that, like, no one misses out on trauma, because I suppose if you've got that as an underlining premise, then it's probably, I suppose, a little more logical to be able to move on from that. Well, why me? And this is so unfair, because of course that has to be how you feel initially, right? And you just think, well, yeah, I suppose how do you get past that? So it's such a healthy and admirable kind of framework to have around it.
Thank you, Dean. It's been brilliant.
No, pleasure. Mate.